In 1867, a ranch hand on the Texas plains earned about $30 a month. His bed was a straw tick in a drafty bunkhouse shared with a dozen men who smelled like horses and tobacco. But breakfast? Breakfast was the one thing nobody complained about, because the cook who fed these men understood something modern nutritionists are only now proving. Number 18 on this list was so calorie-dense that the United States Army studied it during the Civil War. And number 7 used a living organism that scientists today call a superfood. These 30 breakfasts kept men alive through blizzards, cattle drives, and 16-hour days in the saddle. Before we start, hit subscribe, because what ranch cooks knew about feeding hardworking men puts most modern meal plans to shame. Let us count them down. Number 30, hardtack soaked in coffee. Every bunkhouse had a barrel of these bone-dry crackers made from flour, water, and salt. Cowboys called them tooth dullers, sheet iron, and molar chippers. They could survive months without spoiling, which made them essential on every ranch. The trick was soaking them in scalding black coffee until the rock-hard squares softened into something almost chewable. The coffee killed any weevils that had burrowed in during storage, and nobody asked questions about the extra protein floating in the cup. Some hands crumbled the softened hardtack into a bowl and mixed it with bacon grease for a kind of crude porridge. It was ugly food. It was survival food. And every man in that bunkhouse knew that a belly full of hardtack and coffee meant he could ride through a norther without falling from the saddle. Number 29, fried salt pork and rendered fat. Before the sun broke over the corral, the cook was already slicing thick slabs of salt-cured pork belly and dropping them into a cast-iron skillet. The fat rendered out in pools, hissing and spitting over the wood fire. Salt pork was the backbone of the frontier diet, cheap enough that even the stingiest rancher kept barrels of it in the storehouse. A pound cost around 8 cents in the 1870s and lasted for months, packed in brine. The slices fried up crisp on the edges, chewy in the center, salty enough to make a man reach for his canteen. Cowboys ate it between slices of bread or piled on a tin plate next to beans. The leftover grease never got thrown out. It went into biscuits, gravy, beans, and anything else the cook could think of. That rendered pork fat was liquid gold in a frontier kitchen. Number 28, cornmeal mush. Before grits showed up on Southern diner menus, cornmeal mush was feeding ranch hands from Montana to the Rio Grande. The cook stirred ground corn into boiling water, slow and steady, until the pot thickened into a dense golden porridge, served hot with a drizzle of molasses or a spoonful of bacon fat. It hit the stomach like a warm fist and stayed there through the morning. Leftover mush got poured into a tin pan, cooled until solid, then sliced thick and fried in lard the next morning. Those fried slabs developed a crust that crackled when you bit through it, giving way to a soft, creamy center. A 50-pound sack of cornmeal could feed a crew of 12 for weeks. That kind of economy made it sacred in every ranch kitchen west of the Mississippi. Number 27th, Johnny cakes. These flat cornmeal cakes came straight from Native American cooking traditions and landed on every bunkhouse griddle in the West. The recipe was dead simple. Cornmeal, boiling water, a pinch of salt, and maybe a spoonful of bacon drippings mixed into a thick batter and dropped onto a greased skillet. They cooked fast, 3 minutes aside, and came off the iron with crisp edges and a dense, slightly sweet center. Some cooks served them with sorghum syrup. Others used them as edible plates, piling beans and meat right on top. Cowboys called them trail flapjacks and stuffed extras into coat pockets for the long ride out to check fence lines. A Johnny cake did not crumble. It did not spoil quickly, and it could be made by the dozen without anything fancier than a fire and a pan. Number 26, biscuits and sawmill gravy. The smell of biscuits in a cast-iron Dutch oven could pull a sleeping cowboy out of his bedroll faster than a gunshot. The cook mixed flour, lard, salt, and a pinch of baking powder, patted the dough flat, cut rough circles, and crowded them into the greased pot. Coals went on top and underneath, and in 20 minutes, those biscuits rose golden and flaky. The gravy started in the same skillet that fried the morning's salt pork. Flour went into the hot grease, stirred until it browned. Then milk or water got poured in slowly while the cook whisked and cursed. Thick, peppery, flecked with bits of pork, that gravy ladled over split biscuits was the closest thing to heaven a $30 a month cowboy was going to find. Ranchers knew it. A spread with good biscuits kept its hands. A spread with bad biscuits lost them to the outfit down the road. Number 25, bacon and eggs. On ranches big enough to keep a henhouse, eggs were breakfast royalty. The cook cracked them straight into the skillet where bacon had just finished crisping. The whites bubbled in the rendered fat, edges going lacy and brown, while the yolks stayed soft and golden. 2 or 3 eggs per man, 4 strips of thick-cut bacon, and a biscuit on the side. That was a feast by bunkhouse standards. Eggs could not travel on cattle drives. So this was a breakfast men only got when stationed at the home ranch. By the 1880s, a dozen eggs cost about 15 cents in most Western territories. Simple, fast, filling, and available only when you had earned your place at a permanent spread. That made bacon and eggs taste even better. Number 24, sourdough biscuits. Here is where the cook's reputation was made or broken. Every chuck wagon and bunkhouse kitchen had a sourdough starter, a bubbling pot of flour and water, teeming with wild yeast that the cook guarded like a firstborn child. Some starters were years old, passed from cook to cook across ranches and territories. On cold nights, the cook slept with the starter crock tucked into his bedroll to keep the yeast alive. Morning meant pinching off a fist of starter, working in flour and a little lard, and baking the biscuits in a Dutch oven over coals. The result was tangy, tender, and lighter than any baking powder biscuit could dream of being. A good sourdough biscuit split open like a cloud and soaked up gravy without falling apart. Cowboys judged a cook by his sourdough. A man who could keep a healthy starter and produce perfect biscuits every morning at 4 a.m. was worth his weight in silver. Number 23, beans, yes, for breakfast. Pinto beans simmered all night in a cast iron pot over dying coals flavored with salt pork, onion, and dried chili peppers. By dawn, they had turned into a thick, smoky stew. The cook ladled into tin cups alongside everything else on the table. Beans were the single most important food on the frontier. 100 pounds of dried pintos cost $4 in the 1870s and could feed a crew for a month. They packed protein, fiber, and enough slow-burning energy to keep a man working from sunup to dark. The overnight cooking method was not laziness, it was genius. Low heat, over hours, broke down the tough bean skins and made them easier to digest. That mattered when you were spending 14 hours on horseback. Number 22nd, pan de campo, cowboy bread. When the sourdough starter was tired and the biscuit flour was running low, the cook turned to this flatbread that came straight from the Mexican vaquero tradition. Flour, water, lard, salt, and a little baking powder were mixed into a stiff dough, flattened into a thick disc, and baked in a skillet or directly on hot coals. It came out with a crisp shell and a soft, chewy interior that tore apart in thick strips. Pan de campo was the bridge between cultures on the frontier. Anglo cowboys learned it from Mexican ranch hands, who had been making it for generations. It required no yeast, no eggs, no rising time. Mix it, shape it, cook it, eat it. 15 minutes from start to finish. That speed made it invaluable on mornings when cattle had scattered overnight and every minute counted. Number 21, fried corn dodgers. Dense, little, hand-formed nuggets of cornmeal, fried in salt pork grease until the outsides turned dark gold, and the insides stayed slightly gritty and warm. The cook mixed cornmeal with boiling water and salt, shaped the dough into ovals or thick patties, and dropped them into a skillet of hot fat. Corn dodgers lasted for days without spoiling. Cowboys tucked them into saddlebags and shirt pockets. They did not crumble. They did not mold quickly. They even tasted better cold than most things tasted hot. Every corn dodger represented the calories a man might desperately need 3 days down the trail. Number 20. Red eye gravy with ham. Country ham met camp coffee in a cast iron skillet, and the result woke a man up faster than a bucket of creek water. The cook seared thick slices of salt-cured ham until the edges browned and the fat went translucent. Then he pulled the meat out and splashed black coffee directly into the screaming hot pan. The liquid hit the drippings and sizzled into a thin, dark, bittersweet sauce, flecked with brown bits scraped from the iron. Spooned over biscuits or poured across fried potatoes, red eye gravy carried a jolt of caffeine and salt that could restart a dead man's heartbeat. The name came from the little pool of grease that floated in the center of the gravy, staring up from the plate like a bloodshot eye. Nobody knows who invented it, but every bunkhouse cook south of Kansas knew the recipe by instinct. Number 19. Sourdough flapjacks. Same sacred starter, different shape. The cook thinned sourdough with water or milk if he had it, added a little sugar and a pinch of baking soda to cut the sourness, then ladled the batter onto a greased griddle. Bubbles popped across the surface. The edges firmed. A quick flip, and 30 seconds later, a flapjack came off the iron with crisp edges and a soft, tangy center trailing wisps of smoke. Stacked 4 or 5 high and drowned in sorghum syrup or molasses, sourdough flapjacks were the breakfast that made cowboys sing. Literally. Trail songs mention them by name. A man could fold one in half, stuff it into his coat, and eat it cold from the saddle 2 hours later. The sourdough tang actually improved as it cooled, the acids mellowing into something almost sweet. First pattern break. That black coffee the cook brewed every morning before dawn was not just a beverage. It was medicine, ritual, and the glue that held a cattle operation together. The standard recipe was 1 handful of ground coffee per cup of water. Cowboys called it 6-shooter coffee because it was strong enough to float a pistol. Before 1865, the cook had to roast green coffee beans over the fire and grind them by hand. Then John and Charles Arbuckle patented a process for pre-roasting beans coated in egg white and sugar to preserve freshness. Arbuckle's became the coffee of the West. The cook who let the coffee run out was in more danger than the man who lost a steer. A ranch could survive bad beans. It could not survive no coffee. Every bunkhouse morning started and ended with that battered tin pot sitting on the coals, and the first man to pour himself a cup had earned the right by waking before everyone else. Number 17, fried potatoes and onions. When the ranch had a root cellar, and most permanent spreads did, the cook pulled out potatoes and onions and diced them rough into a hot skillet glazed with bacon fat. The potatoes crisped and browned, the onions softened and turned golden. A shake of salt, a crack of pepper, and 10 minutes later you had a skillet full of starch and sweetness that anchored every plate on the table. Potatoes stored through entire winters without spoiling if kept cool and dry. 100 pounds cost about $1.50 in most Western territories during the 1870s. That kind of value made them indispensable. Cowboys who had spent weeks on the trail eating nothing but beans and salt pork would nearly weep at the sight of fried potatoes when they finally returned to the home ranch. Number 16, steak for breakfast. This is the one that surprises people. On working cattle ranches, beef was not saved for supper. The cook would take whatever cut was available, usually a tough piece from a steer slaughtered for the outfit, pound it flat with the back of a skillet, and fry it fast in hot lard. It came off the fire charred on the outside, chewy in the middle, and packed with enough protein to fuel a 12-hour day of roping and branding. During roundup season, when fresh beef was abundant, breakfast steak appeared every morning. A whole carcass had to be consumed quickly since there was no refrigeration. Eating steak at dawn was not a luxury, it was logistics. Number 15. Dried fruit stew. The cook kept barrels of dried apples, raisins, and sometimes apricots in the storehouse. Rehydrated overnight in water and simmered with sugar and a stick of cinnamon if he had one, dried fruit stew was the closest thing to dessert that appeared at breakfast. The sweetness cut through the salt and grease of everything else on the table. Men who had not tasted fresh fruit in months would take second helpings without asking. A pound of dried apples cost about 10 cents and swelled to nearly 3 times its volume when cooked. Some cooks spooned it over biscuits, others served it in tin cups as a side. Either way, it disappeared fast. Number 14. Fried mush. Yesterday's leftover cornmeal mush, sliced thick and laid into a skillet of hot lard. The outside developed a shattering golden crust, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. Drizzled with molasses or dusted with coarse sugar, fried mush was the breakfast that proved frontier cooks understood the principle of waste, nothing. It took what would have been thrown to the hogs and turned it into something men fought over. The hot crust against the cool, dense interior created a contrast of textures that modern chefs would call inspired. Ranch cooks called it Tuesday. Second pattern break. Something most people do not realize is that Chinese cooks played an enormous role in Western ranch kitchens. At the Grant Coors Ranch in Montana, a cook named Sam became legendary for his pies and biscuits. Ranchers actively recruited Chinese immigrants who had worked railroad camps and mining operations because they understood how to feed large crews efficiently with limited supplies. These cooks brought techniques from Canton and adapted them to the ingredients available on the frontier. They stretched flour further, seasoned with whatever grew wild near the ranch, and maintained a level of cleanliness that was rare in bunkhouse kitchens. Their contributions have been largely erased from the cowboy mythology, but the men who ate their cooking never forgot it. Number 12. Biscuits and honey. When a ranch was lucky enough to keep bees or trade with a neighbor who did, honey replaced molasses as the sweetener of choice. A hot sourdough biscuit, split open and drizzled with raw honey, was a breakfast that tasted like civilization in the middle of nowhere. Honey stored indefinitely without spoiling. A single hive could produce 40 pounds in a season, and unlike refined sugar, which had to be shipped from distant mills, honey was local, available, and free once the hive was established. Cowboys spread it thick, the biscuits soaked it up, and for one quiet moment before the day's work began, the bunkhouse table felt almost gentle. Number 11. Scrambled eggs and peppers. On ranches near the Mexican border, the vaquero influence ran deep. Cooks diced wild chilies or dried peppers into scrambled eggs, turning a plain breakfast into something that lit a fire behind a man's eyes. The capsaicin in the peppers increased circulation and woke up the body faster than coffee alone. Served with tortillas or rolled into pan de campo, this was breakfast with a kick that no amount of salt pork could match. Mexican ranch hands had been cooking this way for centuries before Anglo settlers arrived, and the smart ones paid attention. This was the ancestor of every Tex-Mex breakfast plate served in diners from El Paso to San Antonio today. Number 10. Bone marrow on toast. When a steer was slaughtered, nothing was wasted. The cook would split leg bones lengthwise and roast them near the fire until the marrow turned soft and golden. Spread across a slice of toasted bread or a hot biscuit, that marrow was pure, concentrated energy. Rich, buttery, almost sweet, it delivered more calories per ounce than nearly anything else in the bunkhouse kitchen. Modern chefs charge $25 a plate for roasted bone marrow in Manhattan. Ranch cooks in the 1870s served it free because throwing it away was unthinkable. Number 9. Venison hash. When a hunter brought in a deer, the bunkhouse ate well for days. Leftover venison was chopped fine, mixed with diced potatoes and onions, and fried in a cast iron skillet until everything crisped into a golden cake. A fried egg on top made it a complete meal. Venison was leaner than beef, gamier in flavor and free for anyone with a rifle and enough skill to use it. During hard winters, when cattle were too valuable to slaughter, wild game kept the crew fed. The hash stretched a single haunch of venison into breakfast for 10 men. Number 8. Oatmeal with molasses. On northern ranches in Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, where winter temperatures dropped below zero for weeks at a stretch, hot oatmeal was survival. The cook stirred rolled oats into boiling water, cooked them thick, and served bowls topped with a generous pour of blackstrap molasses. That combination delivered iron, slow-burning carbohydrates, and enough warmth to push back against a wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Oats stored well, weighed little, and stretched further than almost any other grain. A man could eat a bowl of oatmeal at 5 in the morning and still feel its warmth in his belly at noon. Number 7. Sourdough starter, straight from the crock. Here is the one that would make a modern nutritionist's head spin. Cowboys on some outfits would dip a spoon directly into the sourdough starter and eat a mouthful raw before breakfast was ready. That bubbling, fermenting paste was packed with wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria, the same probiotics that health food stores now sell for $12 a bottle. The cowboys did not know the science. They just knew that a spoonful of starter settled the stomach, and men who ate it regularly seemed to get sick less often. The cook would chase them away from the crock with a wooden spoon, because every stolen bite meant fewer biscuits, but the hands kept sneaking it anyway. Number 6, son of a gun stew for breakfast. This one had a different name on most ranches, a name I cannot say on YouTube. The cook took the heart, liver, tongue, sweetbreads, and marrow gut of a freshly killed calf and simmered them together with onions and chili peppers. Served at breakfast with biscuits for sopping, this stew was the most nutrient-dense meal on the entire frontier. Organ meats packed iron, B vitamins, and protein at levels that muscle meat could not touch. The marrow gut released a milky substance that thickened the stew naturally. It sounds brutal by modern standards, but on a working ranch where men burned 5,000 calories a day, this stew was the difference between finishing the job and falling out of the saddle. Number 5, biscuits stuffed with leftover stew. The cook split yesterday's biscuits, spooned cold stew or beans into the center, wrapped them in cloth, and handed them out as the crew mounted up before dawn. These stuffed biscuits were the original grab-and-go breakfast, portable enough to eat one-handed from the saddle and filling enough to last until the noon meal. The cold biscuit dough absorbed the stew juices overnight, creating a dense, savory package that tasted better than it had any right to. Nothing was wasted, not the old biscuits, not the bottom of the bean pot, not a single minute of morning daylight. Number 4, milk gravy over anything. When a ranch kept dairy cows, and many did after the 1870s, the cook had access to fresh milk. Flour browned in bacon grease, thinned with whole milk, seasoned with salt and pepper, and stirred into a thick white gravy that went over biscuits, fried steak, potatoes, toast, or just a clean plate and a spoon. Milk gravy was comfort itself. It softened hard bread, enriched lean meat, and turned a sparse table into something that felt like abundance. The milk had to be used fast since there was no refrigeration, so gravy appeared every morning it was available, and nobody ever complained about seeing it twice. Number 3, canned tomatoes on biscuits. After the canning industry took hold in the 1870s, tinned tomatoes became a bunkhouse staple. The cook would open a can, heat the tomatoes in a skillet with salt and a little sugar, and spoon them over split biscuits. The acidity cut through the heaviness of a breakfast built on grease and starch. Cowboys craved them because the vitamin C prevented scurvy during long stretches without fresh produce. A single tin cost about 10 cents and served 4 men. Some cooks added a beaten egg to the hot tomatoes and scrambled them together. Others fried bacon first and let the tomatoes simmer in the drippings. Either way, that bright red splash of color on a plate of beige food meant something important had arrived from somewhere beyond the horizon. Number 2. Slab bacon with skillet cornbread. Thick-cut bacon, sliced from a side that hung in the smokehouse, fried in its own fat until the edges curled and the kitchen filled with smoke. The drippings stayed in the pan. Cornbread batter went in on top, sizzling the instant it hit the iron. The bottom crust formed dark and crunchy, while the top stayed tender and slightly sweet. The cook cut the cornbread into wedges and served it alongside the bacon on tin plates. That combination of smoky pork and warm golden bread, with its crackling crust, was the taste of the American West itself. No meal was simpler. No meal was more satisfying. Number 1. The full bunkhouse spread. On mornings when the entire crew was at the home ranch, when roundup was starting or a big drive was about to launch, the cook laid out everything he had. Sourdough biscuits stacked on a platter, bacon and salt pork sizzling in twin skillets, fried eggs if the hens were laying, a pot of beans that had simmered all night, fried potatoes and onions in a cast iron pan the size of a wagon wheel, gravy in a battered tin pitcher, coffee strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe nail, dried fruit stew for sweetness, and cornbread baked in the Dutch oven before anyone was awake. The men filed in before dawn, boots muddy, hats still on, and filled their plates in silence. The only sound was forks on tin and coffee being poured. That spread was not just food, it was a contract. The rancher was saying, "I will feed you well, and in return, you will work until you cannot stand." Every man at that table understood the deal. They ate like it might be the last real meal for weeks, because sometimes it was. These were not recipes invented by chefs in comfortable kitchens. They were born from necessity, scarcity, and the brutal math of feeding working men on wages that barely covered a pair of boots. The bunkhouse cook had a cast iron skillet, a Dutch oven, a sack of flour, and the knowledge that if breakfast was late or bad, the whole operation suffered. Share which one you would actually eat in the comments, and if you made it this far, subscribe.